So what we're looking at today is continuing on with our square root method. Now the square root method has a few steps. The first is to get the squared term by itself. Now this does work. The square root or this square root method works if we do not have a middle term or x to the first power, just x, or the only variable is inside a set of parentheses being squared.
We need these students to report to room 10. Sarah Johnson, Sydney Lohr, Malin Teehee, and Hanley Wiggins. Thank you.
So here we do have a squared term. We do not have an x to the first. So the first thing we need to do is get that squared term by itself. So the first thing we can do here is add 31 to both sides, because our negative 31 plus 31 is 0, leaving us with 4x squared is equal to 80. I think we did this one yesterday, but that's fine. And we would divide both sides by 4, telling us x squared is equal to 20. So we did the first step. We got the x squared term or squared term by itself. Our second step is to take the square root of both sides. Take square root of both sides. So here we would take the square root of x squared and the square root of 20. Well, our square root of x squared would be x. Anytime we take the square root of both sides, we have to put a plus or minus. Because what we're looking at is what times itself is 20. Then we need to find out what the square root of 20 is. The 30xs is nice about this, because I can plug in the square root of 20, and it'll tell us in simplest radical form, it is 2 square root of 5. Questions on this here? We're ready for the third step. Solve for x. We need to solve for x. We need to solve for the variable. This is a variable by itself. Yeah, so we don't have to really, we've solved for it. We're done. And that's it there. Now I did show this yesterday because negative 2 square root of 5 squared is indeed 20. Negative 2 times negative 2 is going to give us 4. Square root of 5 times square root of 5 is 5. So that does work out to give us 20. And our 2 square root of 5 squared is also 20. So both of those are our answers. Questions on this here? Let's look at the next one here. 3x squared minus 9 is equal to 0. We don't have a middle term. So what's the first thing we can do? We need to get the squared term by itself. So we can do what? We can add 9 to both sides, telling us that 3x squared is equal to 9. Is the squared term by itself? The 3. We need to divide both sides by 3 to get x squared by itself, because our 3x squared divided by 3 is x squared. 9 divided by 3 is 3. At this point here, we can move on to step 2 and take the square root of both sides, because the square root of x squared is x. Equals, whenever we take the square root or an even root of both sides, we have to put the plus or minus. Square root of 3. Well, second square root of 3 is square root of 3. It doesn't reduce, it doesn't simplify. So the values of x that make this function be 0 is positive or negative square root of 3. If we wanted to check and make sure, we could plug it into the original equation. 3 times the square root of 3 squared minus 9 is, lo and behold, 0. 3 parentheses negative square root of 3 squared minus 9 is still 0. And that's it. Questions on this here? Questions on anything so far? We ready for the next one? Now this we can still solve by the square root method because we do still only have a single x and it's located inside a set of parentheses being squared. So this still works. The only time that we wouldn't be able to use the square root method on a problem like this here is if we had a variable also outside the radical, or outside the parentheses. But since it's still inside the parentheses, this still works. Now, yes, it is different than the last two we did. Would y'all agree with that? Because it looks different. Now, what's our first step? Get the squared term by itself. Well, what's the term being squared? X plus 3. That term is being squared. Steps still work. Steps still function just as they did. But instead of just getting x squared by itself, we want to get what? X plus 3. That whole quantity being squared by itself. So the first thing we need to do is get the 2/5 away from it. How could I get the 2/5 to the other side? Yes, we can divide both sides by 2/5. Because on the left side, our 2/5 divided by 2/5 simplify to 1, leaving us with x plus 3 squared. On the other side, we have 5 over 2/5. And 5 divided by 2/5 is 25 over 2. Questions on this so far? Questions on anything we've done so far? Is the term being squared by itself? So what's with that term being squared? So the plus 3 is there, yes, but it's actually a part of the term being squared because our whole term that's being squared is the x plus 3 because that whole term is being squared, so we don't have to mess with the plus 3 yet. Does that make sense? Because that whole thing's being squared, so it is by itself. Because at this point, we can take the square root of both sides, because if I take the square root of x plus 3 squared, well, the square root and square here will cancel. Now, if we had something added to the outside of it, if it was x plus 3 squared, and then say I had plus 2, we would have to move the plus 2 since it's outside of the parentheses. Yes, sir? Yes. Does that make sense? But since we don't have that plus 2, we can go on and take the square root of our x plus 3 squared, and it just reduces to x plus 3 equals, well, since I took the square root of one side, we have to take the square root of the other. Let me grab the calculator. Now the 30xs won't just take the square root of 25 halves and give it to us in simplest radical form. But if we type it in as the square root of the numerator, square root of the top, over the square root of the denominator, square root of the bottom, square root of 25 divided by square root of 2. The 30xs will simplify that for us into 5 square roots of 2 over 2. Questions on this here? Okay. Last step, solve for x, solve for the variable. Is the variable by itself? No, now we have that plus 3. So to solve for x, we would have to minus 3 from both sides. Whenever we add or subtract a number at this point, especially with that plus or minus, that positive, negative, we want to put that number in front of it. Put the number in front of that plus or minus. So we get negative 3 plus or minus 5 square roots of 2 over 2. Questions on this so far? Now, because of the square root of 2 attached to our other term, this is the final answer, because negative 3 and our 5 square roots of 2 over 2 are not like terms, because the square root of 2 is technically an irrational number, a non-repeating, non-terminating decimal. So this here is the final answer. We can't combine those. We can't actually add or subtract them because they're not like terms. That is not the same. We would have to convert our 5 square roots of 2 over 2 into a decimal before we can add and subtract. Does that make sense? Okay. Questions on this here? Are we ready for the next one? Two-thirds x squared plus 14 equals 20. Hey, square root method. We can get this x squared term, our squared term by itself. So the first thing we can do is what? Minus 14. Which tells us that 2/3 x squared is equal to 6. What do we need to do next? We still need to get the x squared by itself, yes? So what's with it? 2/3. So how can we get the 2/3 to the other side? We can divide both sides by 2/3. Incidentally enough, 6 divided by 2/3 is 9. Is the squared term by itself? Yeah. So we can move on to step 2. We take the square root of both sides. Now our square root of x squared is x is equal to plus or minus. Now we need to take the square root of 9. What times itself is 9? 3. So we have positive, negative 3. Now we technically do have solve for x, solve for the variable. The variable's already solved for, yes? Wait a minute. That is a nice number, isn't it? So if I wanted to try graphing it, I would have to subtract the 20 from both sides. I need to get it equal to 0. We feel comfortable with that step? Because I kind of skipped a step, but we did. I get here. Not what I wanted. 2/3 Okay, we see it does cross the x-axis. Well, when x is equal to negative 3, the y value is 0. When x is equal to 3, the y value is. So did we necessarily have to do the square root method for this one? No, this one graphed just fine. If the solutions work out to be integers, It means we could have graphed the thing and gotten the answers. Questions on this here? Negative 2x squared plus 1 equals negative 6. If we tried graphing this one here, negative 2x squared minus 7. Oh, that's why. It's not minus 7. That doesn't look right. Plus 7. Okay, it does cross the x-axis in 2 places. On the scale, it looks like it's crossing near 2 and negative 2. Well, neither one of those gives us a value of 0. So unfortunately, we can't graph it. But square root method does work because we do have an x squared term. We don't have x. So the first thing we need to do is get x squared by its self. So what's the first thing we can do? Minus 1 from both sides. Telling us that negative 2x squared is equal to negative 7. What can we do next? Divide by? Yes, 2, but specifically negative 2. Because we want that x squared to be positive x squared. Now, negative 7 divided by negative 2. Negative divided by a negative is a positive. Well, we could turn it into a decimal, but for us finding these solutions, it's going to be better to leave it as a fraction. Now, at this point here, we do have our squared term by itself, so we can take the square root of both sides. And our square root of x squared is going to reduce to x equals. Because we took the square root of both sides, we have to put the plus or minus. Now, to simplify our square root of 7/2, especially in the calculator, as we saw earlier, we do need to split it up and take the square root of 7 over the square root of 2, which does reduce to the square root of 14 over 2. And that's going involving with our properties of radicals. Questions on how we got to this step here? All right. Our last step is to solve for x. Well, in our case here, x is already by itself. It's already solved for. So this here is our final answer. Questions on this here? Are we ready for the next one? Two times x minus 4 squared equals negative 5. So again, even though it does look different, and it is kind of different, because the x only shows up inside our parentheses being squared, our term being squared, we can still use the square root method. And the first thing we can do is divide both sides by 2. Because our 2 divided by 2 will cancel out, leaving us with x minus 4 squared is equal to negative 5/2. What can we do next? We can take square root of both sides. And on the left-hand side, our square root and square would cancel, telling us that we have just x minus 4 is equal to. We do need to simplify our square root of negative 5/2. So we can take the square root of negative 5 over the square root of 2, yes, which is Main error. Okay. Maybe it's the negative on top. Let's put it on bottom. Doesn't work. I cannot take the square root of a negative number. So, okay. Let's go back up to the top. Now, if, add the 5 over. Because I'm wanting to graph it. So if we add the 5, it will make the right side be 0. Yes? You would agree with that? And it gives us 2 times x minus 4 squared plus 5. So y equals, clear that out, 2 parentheses x minus 4 squared plus 5. And we're looking for where it crosses the x-axis. Where does it cross the x-axis? It doesn't. So that tells me that this here has no real solutions. It does have solutions, they're just not real solutions. Because if it had equaled positive 5 instead of negative 5, this would have had solutions. But we're going to come back to it. Especially after fall break, we'll actually be able to solve problems like this here. Questions on this here? We're ready for the next one. Solve x squared minus 4x equals 45 by factoring. Now, solve it by factoring. We've done a few of these here. We did this in 3.13. Because with factoring, graphing, 2 of the 3 ways we've learned to solve, we need the equation equal to 0. There's only one that we've learned so far that we don't need it equal to 0, and that's the square root method. That one, we can have it equal whatever because we're trying to get that squared term by itself. So here, we need to get this equation equal to 0. And the first thing we can do is subtract 45 from both sides. Tell me that x squared minus 4x minus 45 is equal to 0. Now we can start factoring. Our first step in factoring is to find a greatest common factor and factor it out. Is there a greatest common factor between these 3 terms? No. So we can move on to step number 2, our 2 sets of parentheses with 3 spaces. Find the sign. If the third term is positive, the signs are the same and match the sign of the middle term. If the third term is negative, our signs are opposite. Here, the sign of the third term is negative, so our signs are positive and negative. They're opposite. Questions on this so far? Now we need to find the factors of the first and third term. So our factors of x squared are, well, x and x. The only factors we have for x squared. Factors of 45 are 1 and 45. 2 doesn't work, but 3 and 15. 4 is not a factor, but 5 and 9. 6 doesn't work because 2 and 3 don't. And that's pretty much it. Because 7 is not a factor, and that's the last one we can have. So looking at these 3 sets of factors, which one do we want to try first? 3 and 15? And we can check this here. X times negative 15 is negative 15x. 3 times x, positive 3x, giving us negative 12x. Is that the middle term we wanted? Now, because the first term, we just have x and x, switching the 3 and 15 is just going to change it from negative 12x to positive 12x. Because all we're doing is switching the sign. So 3 and 15 is not going to be the ticket. What can we try next? 5 and 9. Which one do we want to put first? 9? 5. And we can check this here. X times negative 5 is negative 5x. 9 times x is positive 9x. And negative 5x plus 9x is positive 4x. Is that the middle term we want? So we need it, but it is the correct number, yes? So if it's the correct number but wrong sign, we need to switch the signs. And if we check this one last time, x times 5x is positive 5x. Negative 9 times x is negative 9x, giving us negative 4x. So that x minus 9 times x plus 5 equals 0. Whenever we have two or more things equal to 0, two or more things being multiplied together that equals 0, one of them has to be 0. That's just our zero product property. X minus 9 equals 0. X plus 5 equals 0. To solve our x minus 9, we would need to add 9 to both sides because our negative 9 plus 9 is 0. Telling us x is equal to 9. X plus 5, we would do what? Subtract 5 from both sides. Telling us x is equal to negative 5. So our two solutions are 9 and negative 5, yes? Are both of those integers? Yeah, they're non-fraction numbers. That means I could have graphed this and gotten the same answers. But it asked us to factor them. Questions on this here? Three x squared minus 5x equals 2. Now again, it specifically asks for us to solve it by factoring. So we'll need to factor it to solve. Now we will have problems like this on the test, and there are points associated with solving it by the correct method. So you do get points for getting the correct answers, but you will need to be able to solve it by the correct way. So here, factoring. With factoring, we need to get this equation equal to 0. So the first thing we can do is subtract 2 from both sides. On the right-hand side, our 2 minus 2 is 0. On the left-hand side, we do not have any like terms between our 3x squared, negative 5x, and negative 2. So we just put it next to it. So we have two sets of parentheses with 3 spaces. If the third term is positive, the signs are the same and match the sign of the middle term. If the third term is negative, our signs are opposite. So here our third term is negative, so our signs are positive and negative. Factors, first and third term, factors of 3x squared. Well, the x squared part would be x and x. Our factors of 3 are 1 and 3. So we can fill the 3 in and the 1 in. Our third term is 2. So our factors of 2 are what? 1 and 2. Where do you all want to put the 1? Where do you want to put the 2? 1 with the 3, 2 with the 1x. And the last thing we can do is check before solving. 3x times negative 2 is negative 6x. 1 times x is plus x, giving us negative 5x. Now at this point here, we just need to solve for x. Since we have two things multiplied together to equal 0, one of these two has to be 0. Either 3x plus 1 is equal to 0, or x minus 2 is equal to 0. Well, with our 3x plus 1 to solve, first thing we'll need to do is subtract 1 from both sides, telling us 3x is equal to -1. And last but not least, we would divide by 3, telling us x is equal to -1/3. X minus 2 equals 0. First thing we do is what? Add 2, so x is equal to, done. Questions on this here? Are you ready for the next one? All right. So that's getting us near the end. I think we have 3 problems left, yes? So this here, it asks us to find the zeros. We need to find the zeros. And interestingly enough, finding the zeros isn't any different than what we've been doing. Because when it mentions finding the zeros, all it's saying is find what values of x that will make the function be what? 0. That's all it's saying. So when it says to find the zeros, it's just what value of x will make the function be 0. Now, does it specifically tell us how we need to solve this here? No, so I can use any method. So if I wanted to, I can take the graphing calculator and say 2x squared minus 11x plus 12 and tell it to graph. Well, it does intersect the graph at 2 places, yes? Second table. Well, one of those solutions, one of the values of x that will make the function be 0 is 4, yes? But how many times did it cross the x-axis? 2. It's not giving us the other one. There is another solution, and it's somewhere between 1 and 2. So we do know one of them is 4, but we're going to have to factor this to find the other. If you're able to find one of the solutions of a quadratic by graphing, you can find the other by factoring. You can find them both by factoring. There is no greatest common factor between 2x squared, 11x, and 12. So we go on to our 2 sets of parentheses with 3 spaces. Since our third term is positive, the signs are the same and match the sign of the middle term. So it would be negative and negative. Now we need to find the factors of the first and third term. So our factors of 2x squared, well, the x squared would be x and x. What are our factors of 2? Well, 1 and 2. Where do you want to put the 2? First one. I will tell you this here. If both of the signs are the same, it really doesn't matter. We just got to stick it in 1. Factors of 12. There are a few. 1 and 12. 2 and 6. 3 and 4. Which one do we want to use? I would say 12 and 1, we'd try it. Did we find a solution already? Because on the graphing calculator, it did tell us a solution, yes? Which was 4. Yes? Do we have a factor of 4? So it might be 3 and 4. So even though graphing, it did give both of us these solutions, it does give us a hint at what it might be. Now we can check this and make sure. 2x times negative 4 is negative 8x. Negative 3 times x is negative 3x. Negative 8 minus 3, negative 8x minus 3x is indeed negative 11x. Is that the middle term we wanted? Yes. Since we have two things multiplied together to equal 0, one of them must be 0. I'm going to do the one on the right first. Solve it, add 4 to both sides. Surprise, surprise. It tells us that x is equal to 4. Well, we already knew that. We got that from graphing, yes? We just need to find the other one. 2x minus 3 equals 0. Well, the first thing we can do is add 3 from both sides. Yes, thank you. So 2x is equal to 3. And then we can divide both sides by 2, telling us x is equal to 3/2. So our solutions are x is equal to 3/2 and x is equal to 4. Well, that's kind of what we got from graphing, because we said the other one had to be between 1 and 2. Well, 3/2 is indeed between 1 and 2. Questions on this here? X squared minus 8x. Again, if we want to find the zeros, we need to find out what value of x will make this function be 0. Did it specify how we need to solve this? No, it just told us to find them. So that means if I want to, I can come over here and say x squared minus 8x, yes? That looks like it does intersect at nice points, yes? Let's see, second graph. What's one of our solutions? What's one of the values of x that makes a y value be 0? 8 and that's it. Now, if we wanted to factor it, we could. And I want to show this with factoring because this is a little different. Because greatest common factor. Is there a common factor, common term between x squared and 8x? They both have an x. We don't have a term without a variable. So x is shared with both. So I can factor an x out of both terms. Because if I factor an x out of x squared, we get x. If I factor the x out of 8x, we just get 8. Questions on that there? Because this is one of the first ones where we didn't have a constant term, a number without a variable. So we can factor that variable out. Now we do have two things multiplied together that equal 0. So either x minus 8 equals 0 or x is equal to 0. Right by itself, so x is 0. X minus 8 equals 0. We can solve this by adding 8 to both sides, so x is equal to 8. Which we got both of those by factoring. Questions on this here? We ready for the last one? I will tell you right now, this is not going to graph. Well, we can graph it, it just does not intersect at nice points. There is no greatest common factor. So we'll move on to our two sets of parentheses with 3 spaces. Since the third term is positive, the signs are the same and they match the sign of the middle term. So we'd have plus and plus. Now we need to find the factors of 4x squared. Well, x squared would be x and x. Factors of 4 are 1 and 4 or 2 and 2. Okay, right now it is 2 and 2. Factors of 49. 1 and 49 or 7 and 7. We'll want 7 and 7. And if we do check this here, 2x times positive 7 is 14x. 7 times positive 2x is plus. 14x plus 14x is 28x. And since we have two things that multiply together to equal 0, one of them must be 0. Either 2x plus 7 is equal to 0 or 2x plus 7 is equal to 0. Subtract 7 from both sides, telling us 2x is equal to -7. Then we would divide by 2, telling us x is equal to -7/2. Interestingly enough, we would do the exact same thing on the other side, telling us that x is still just -7/2. Questions on any of this here? That's it.